See, all powerful means you can do anything you want. Heavy emphasis on what you want. Heavy emphasis on what you desire to do. God cannot do some things. Think about that. There are some things God just cannot do, and yet He's all powerful. But the things that God cannot do are those things that are contrary to His nature. God cannot act contrary to His holiness. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13, it says, God cannot deny Himself. That means He cannot act contrary to Himself. Some have argued the hypothesis I said about the rock. They've argued other things, that how can God be all-powerful if He refuses to change? With our progressive culture today, why can't God just change and accept it? Why can't He just go along with it? If He's all-powerful, He could do that. Well, there's a part about God and His nature that refuses to allow Him to do that, and it's called His holiness. God cannot act contrary to Himself. That very nature of God supersedes everything else. And so everything that God does has to be in accordance with His holiness, because that's who He is. God cannot, just like I did with Aaron, God cannot force you to receive Him. He cannot, in fact, if you say, can God make a rock so big He can't move it? He did. It's called a heart. God has made hearts that He cannot move. It's something you have to move yourself. God can woo you, and He can offer you His free gift, and He can love you, and He can bring circumstances around. But the choice is yours. He cannot force you to love Him. It's contrary to His nature to do that. Because at that point, He's no longer acting in love, and God is love, but rather He's making you no better than a robot, and He's treating you with total disrespect. So let's just get that down. God cannot do anything that's contrary to His nature. God can't force you to turn your heart to Him. However, in accordance with His holiness mixed with His love, when people were separated from His holiness, He made a plan to be able to bring people back into His holiness. God created a way for us to return to Him once we had rejected Him. He created a way by sending Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice. See, God's law said that He told Adam and Eve this: once you sin, you have to die. That was both a spiritual and a physical death. Once you do this, you have to die. The penalty for sin is death. The Scripture is clear on that. But what God did in sending His Son was to take the penalty and the curse upon Himself. So that when God's law has been justified, He can then justify those who turn to Him. God can't force you to come to Him. He can't force you to receive His free gift of eternal life. But once you receive what He's done for you, John chapter 1, He came to His own and they rejected Him. But He made it now that anyone who would receive Him, He gives the right to become children of God. Anyone who receives Him makes that choice. So it's the choice is on ours. God provided the way. But it was just like that gift I wanted to give to Aaron. God says, here, Larry, take it. For 20 years of my life, I rejected it. For 20 years of my life, I knew it was there. I refused to take it. God provided a way for His holiness to be appeased. And that was through Jesus Christ and the sacrifice that He made. I want to tell you about a vision I had shortly after I committed my life to Christ. Now, when I committed my life to Christ, I was an introvert. I hated to be around people. I didn't like talking to people. In fact, the opposite was so. There were some people that I had hurt. I was filled with fear and anxieties, and being around people just caused me more stress. But the night I asked Christ into my life, and it was just a simple prayer, here I am, if you can do anything with me, take me, because I couldn't do anything else. And it was just a few weeks later, after I had made that prayer of giving him my life, I was praying, and suddenly I went into a trance. I don't have any other word for it, a dream, a vision. And it only lasted a few seconds, but the experience seemed to have lasted about a half hour, but it was only about maybe 2 minutes from the time I went into it to the time I came out of it. Now, I'd never had an experience like that before, and I never believed things like that were even possible. And it's still very emotional to this day, almost 50 years later. I saw my best friends. Never had a desire for this, never saw anything coming like this at all, but I had this clear picture of my friends with these huge bear chains, bear traps stuck to their legs, just digging in, bleeding, tearing them apart, tearing them down. On the end of it, a great big metal ball. And that ball was rolling and dragging them to this huge cliff. And on the other side of that cliff was nothing but fire. And I want you to know this was real. It was just like I was watching it actually happen. And even talking about it right now, I still see it very vividly. And each one of those chains around their legs, there was a lock. And I had a key. And it would unlock that shackle. And I would go to my best friends, and I can still picture every one of them, and I would say, let me take the trap off your leg. And every one of them, one by one, would push me away and say, I don't have any trap. What's wrong with you? You're the one who's trapped. You're crazy. I was free, and I could run around to all of them, and I could talk to them. I can still vividly remember each one of my friends, some who have since passed away without Christ. And I was saying, let me take the lock. Let me take that thing off your leg. Let me just set you free. I've got the key to it. And one by one, I watched as people I loved perished. And I just kept saying, why won't you listen? And I woke up. I came out of it. And the experience was so emotional to me, I had to go and ask the foreman to let me take the rest of the day off. And I went to a lake and I walked and I said, God, what did that mean? And he told me, I'm the key. And your friends will reject it. They'll have lots of excuses. And I said, then why should I even go try it and take the traps off their legs? He said, maybe some will listen. And since that vision I had, it was just about 3 weeks later that the little church in Detroit was given to me. And all I wanted to do was tell people about Jesus, the one who can set them free. But one by one, some of my closest friends would laugh at me. They'd push me away. They didn't want to listen. They didn't want to hear it. I'd gone from being one way to suddenly being a different way. See, God doesn't change in His holiness, but He changes me from my wickedness. And there's an old saying, it was a song back after I shortly became a follower of Christ. And it said, I'm not what I want to be. I'm not what I'm going to be. But thank God I'm not what I used to be. And I just embraced that and moved forward. And so my friends would laugh at me. And I made friends with a bunch of guys who had their own marijuana plantations out in the woods where I lived. And I'd go out with them while they were harvesting. And I'd talk with them about the Lord. And one by one, they would come into church, that little church I had. And we didn't know nothing. We didn't know anything. Mesopotamia was pronounced Mesopotamia. We had the book of Filipinos that we studied quite often. We didn't know anything. And we were just a bunch of hippies that didn't know anything other than we believed God loved people like us. God sent us an old lady. Her name was Fowler. We called her Grandma. I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to be around us. But she came and she started going to church with us and she started playing the piano with us. And she was incredible. Maybe I told this once before. One time she was playing along and she just, the old rugged cross or how great thou art, something, she just took off and started playing this really weird thing. We thought she got filled with the Spirit or something. She just took off. And then she stopped. She touched her hymn book and the fly flew away. She was trying to play the fly as he was walking across. Not bad for a 90-year-old woman, but we loved her and she loved us. And she kept teaching us that God did love us the way we were. But he loved us too much to keep us that way. That he would bring about changes that would begin to reflect him, would begin to reflect his holiness. But I learned real quick, you can't force people to accept it. See, people can argue my theology, they can argue my knowledge, they can argue my take on things. You can never argue my personal experience with Christ. And that's the greatest testimony we have. What has Jesus done for you? And for 50 years, that's all I've tried telling people, what Jesus has done for me and is doing for me in my life. Still not perfect, still far from it. But I'm not what I used to be. When I was working in the woods, at this time I was working in the woods and pastoring a little church. There was a man, I'll only refer to him as Roger. And he worked on the landing, and I was chasing, and he was up there cleaning off the landing and loading and working with me, kind of teaching me what to do. And there was a truck that came in, and I can't remember if the last name was Browning or something, but it was J.C. Browning, I believe was the name on the truck. And every time that truck would come in to get a load of logs, Roger would tip his hat at it and bow. And they would leave. He didn't do that with any other truck. And so while we were out there working, and I finally asked him, I said, Roger, why do you tip your hat to J.C. Browning's truck every time he comes in and goes out? And he goes, I'll tip my hat to anybody with the initials J.C. And so I asked him, I said, well, Roger was a heathen. I mean, this guy was constantly cheating on his wife and carousing, doing everything you could possibly think of that's wrong. And so I asked him, I said, well, Roger, do you believe in Jesus? He says, yes, I do. And I said, well, have you asked him to be a part of your life? Because I was thinking, man, it doesn't show. And he goes, no. He said, I know I need to do that, and someday I will. But not right now. I've got too many things I want to do. And I said, what? Well, I like to party, and he laid out all the things. He said, I'm not going to stop doing those things right now. I don't want to stop doing those things. I still want my life. He said, one day though, I know I need to ask him to be a part of my life. It was about a week later, Roger came home and found his wife in bed with another man. He could cheat on her. But when he found that she cheated on him, he went out and killed himself. The last thing he did without Jesus. He died. Short time after that, I was at a care center and I was talking to an old man. His name was Dell. And I would sit and talk with Dell, and he liked me because I was the one who would sit with him and talk with him and light his cigarettes. And while I was sitting there talking with him, he must have lit 15, 20 cigarettes in the half hour, 40 minutes that I was there with him. I had never saw anybody smoke a cigarette so fast. Then it'd just kind of like go down. But he had arthritis real bad, and so as he was sitting in a chair like this, and I'd light it, and then he could smoke, and we would talk. And I took a lot of criticism from people saying that I shouldn't have, been helping him with his addiction. But we would sit and talk, and Del would talk about when he was a boy and he was raised in church, how he didn't really like the pastor and he didn't like the church itself, and there were things wrong with it. And I said, Jesus isn't the church. The church is supposed to reflect Jesus, but not all of them do. And I said, have you ever considered a personal relationship with Christ? And that began a conversation that went for about 10 months with Del. And I'd come in, and each time he'd say, I know I need Christ in my life. I know I need to surrender to him. But there's still just a few things I want to do. And I looked at him in his wheelchair like this. I said, what are you going to do? Pinch a nurse? I said, well, I don't understand. What other things? He goes, no, there's just still some things I want to do. Last time I saw Dell, that's what he said to me. The last thing he said, there's still some things I want to do. That night he passed away. And I don't know if he asked Christ into his life or if the last thing he ever did was to die without Jesus. But you see, it's a free gift that God has to give us. He can't force us to take it. And we can't force somebody like you, Lori, wanting to go back and grab him and say, I'm going to bring you up here and make you take it. Although I know some parents that would like to do that with their kids. I know some parents who did do that with their kids. It was my mom and dad. But the reality is there comes a time where God speaks to your heart. And you either say yes or you say, there's still a few more things I want to do. And Jesus will always go, okay. And each time we do that, what he's saying is, I've got a key. And you're in a trap, and I can set you free. And we can thumb our nose at him and push him away like I did for the first 20 years of my life and say, I don't see a trap. See, I can't force my friends to commit their lives to Christ. All I can do is offer Jesus and the free gift that he has. And pray that they might do something about it.